The Oconee River ran cold that October morning in 1847, carrying with it the scent of rotting leaves and something darker, something metallic that made Ayana's stomach turn before she even reached the water's edge. She had come at dawn to check her fishing nets, as she did every morning, moving through the Georgia woods with the silence her grandmother had taught her. The mist hung low over the water, thick as wool, and in it she could barely see 10 feet ahead. But she saw the body. It floated face down among the reeds, one arm caught in the tangled roots of a cypress tree. The current pulled at it gently, rhythmically, like the river was trying to decide whether to keep it or let it go. Ayana froze on the muddy bank, her bare feet sinking into the soft earth. Her first thought was that it was a deer. Hunters sometimes left carcasses to rot, but then she saw the torn fabric of a shirt, the dark skin of a human back, and the unmistakable bloom of fresh blood spreading through the water like ink. She should have walked away. That's what her uncle would have told her. That's what anyone with sense would have done. The body was trouble, white man's trouble. And Ayana had survived 3 years alone in these woods, precisely because she knew how to avoid trouble. But something in the way the man's fingers still gripped the root, even in unconsciousness, made her wade into the water. The cold shocked her legs as she moved deeper, her doe-skin dress floating up around her thighs. She reached the body and turned it over with effort, gasping as his face broke the surface. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. He was younger than she expected, maybe 25, with a strong jaw and scars crisscrossing his shoulders like a map of suffering. A bullet wound gaped just below his collarbone, still bleeding sluggishly into the river. His eyes were closed, his lips blue, but when she pressed her fingers to his neck, she felt it. A pulse, faint and stubborn. He was alive. Ayana looked around wildly, her heart hammering. The woods were empty, the morning birds just beginning their songs. No one had followed him here, not yet, but they would. Men like this didn't end up in rivers by accident. She knew what he was even before she saw the iron collar hidden beneath the water, half broken and crusted with dried blood. A runaway, a slave, and if she helped him, if anyone found out, they would hang her from the nearest tree without a second thought. She gripped him under the arms and began to pull. He was heavy, dead weight against the current, and twice she nearly lost him. Her muscles screamed as she dragged him onto the bank, his body leaving a dark trail through the mud. She knelt beside him, panting, and pressed her hands against the wound in his chest. Blood welled between her fingers, hot and insistent. He needed a healer, someone who understood bullet wounds and fever and infection. But there was no healer. There was only her, a Cherokee woman living in exile at the edge of a world that wanted her dead as much as it wanted him enslaved. Foolish, she whispered to herself in Cherokee, her grandmother's language, the one she spoke only when she was alone. This is foolish, Ayana. But her hands were already moving. She tore a strip from her dress and bound the wound tightly, then checked his breathing. It was shallow but steady. His skin was cold, his body shaking with shock, and she knew if she left him here, he would be dead by noon, either from the wound or from the men who would come looking. She thought of her cabin, hidden a half-mile into the woods, buried so deep in the pines that even the hunters rarely found it. She thought of the dried herbs hanging from her rafters, the poultices her grandmother had taught her to make, the warm fire that burned day and night in her small hearth. She thought of the last time she had trusted a stranger. That had been 3 years ago, when the soldiers came to drive her people west on what they called the Indian removal. She had watched her mother die on the march, watched her father collapse in the snow, watched her younger brother dragged away when he tried to run. Ayana had survived only because she had slipped away one night, vanishing into the Carolina mountains and eventually making her way here, to this forgotten corner of Georgia where no one cared about one Cherokee woman living alone. She had sworn then that she would never again put herself at risk for anyone. Survival meant solitude. Survival meant silence. And yet, she looked down at the man's face, slack in unconsciousness, and saw something that made her chest tighten. He had fought. Even now, even broken and bleeding, his body carried the evidence of resistance, the scars, the broken collar, the gunshot wound that proved he had refused to accept his chains. She had seen that same defiance in her brother's eyes the night he tried to run. She had seen it in her own reflection every morning since. "Damn you," she whispered in English, the language of her enemies, the language she had learned from missionaries who came to save her people before betraying them. "Damn you for making me remember." She hooked her arms under his shoulders again and began to drag him toward the woods. Every few feet she had to stop and catch her breath, her back aching, her arms trembling. The forest swallowed them slowly, first the pines, then the oaks, then the thick underbrush that clawed at her legs. She moved by instinct, following the hidden trails she had carved over 3 years, trails that looked like nothing more than deer paths to anyone who didn't know better. The man groaned once, a low animal sound that made her freeze, but his eyes didn't open. She kept moving. By the time she reached her cabin, the sun had fully risen, burning off the mist and painting the forest in shades of gold and green. The cabin was small, barely more than a single room with a stone fireplace and a pallet of furs in the corner. But it was hers. She had built it with her own hands, cutting the logs and sealing the gaps with mud and moss. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by blackberry bushes and wild grapevines, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. She dragged the man inside and laid him on the furs, then immediately set to work. She stoked the fire until it roared, filled a pot with water from the rain barrel, and began pulling down bunches of dried herbs, yarrow for bleeding, golden seal for infection, willow bark for fever. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, grinding and mixing, her grandmother's voice echoing in her mind, with instructions passed down through generations. She cleaned the wound with hot water and packed it with a poultice that made the man's body jerk, a reflexive response to the pain even in unconsciousness. As she worked, she studied him more closely. He was tall, powerfully built, despite obvious malnourishment, with hands that were calloused and scarred from hard labor. His face was handsome in a way that made her uncomfortable to notice. A strong nose, full lips, a jawline that spoke of pride, even in defeat. But it was his back that told the real story. When she rolled him over to check for other wounds, she saw the lattice of scars that covered him from shoulders to waist. Whip marks, dozens of them, layered over years. Some were old and silver, others more recent and still raised. She had seen scars like these before, on the few escaped slaves who had passed through Cherokee territory during her childhood, but never this many, never this brutal. "What did you do?" she whispered, tracing one particularly deep scar with her fingertip, "to make them hate you this much?" He didn't answer, of course. He lay motionless, except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest, his body fighting a war she couldn't see. She covered him with a blanket woven from rabbit fur and sat back on her heels, suddenly exhausted. The reality of what she had done crashed over her like a wave. She had brought a runaway slave into her home. She had committed an act that, in the eyes of Georgia law, was worse than murder. If they found him here, they would burn her cabin, hang him from a tree, and probably hang her beside him for good measure. And even if they didn't find him, even if he survived, what then? He couldn't stay here forever, he couldn't go back, and she couldn't send him into the woods alone, wounded and hunted. She had trapped herself. Outside, a crow cawed 3 times, a warning call. Ayana moved to the window, a small opening covered with oiled cloth, and peered out into the forest. Nothing moved in the clearing. The morning was peaceful, deceptively so, with butterflies dancing over the blackberry bushes and a mockingbird singing from a nearby oak. But she knew better than to trust peace. Peace was always temporary in the South. Violence was the only constant. She turned back to the man on her floor. This stranger whose name she didn't know, whose life she had chosen to save for reasons she didn't fully understand. He looked smaller now, more vulnerable, his face slack with fever. She knelt beside him again and placed a cool cloth on his forehead, checking his pulse, still weak, still fighting. "You better be worth this," she said quietly, knowing he couldn't hear her, knowing it didn't matter. "You better survive because I just risked everything for you." The man's eyes moved beneath his closed lids, rapid and frantic, lost in dreams she couldn't reach. She wondered what he saw there, his past, his escape. The moment the bullet tore through his chest, she wondered if he dreamed of freedom, or if, like her, he had learned that freedom was just another word for running. As the morning stretched into afternoon, Ayana worked in silence, changing his bandages, forcing water between his lips, monitoring the fever that made his skin burn hot as coals. She had delivered herself into the hands of fate, and now all she could do was wait. Wait for him to wake or die. Wait for the hunters to come or pass. Wait for the consequences of mercy to reveal themselves. The river had given him to her, half dead and bleeding. Now she would see if she could give him back his life. Ayana was changing his bandages when it happened, her fingers working carefully around the inflamed edges of the bullet wound. The fever had broken the night before, finally, after 72 hours of delirium, during which he had thrashed and screamed words she couldn't understand, names of people she would never know, places she had never been. She had held him down through the worst of it, forced water and willow bark tea between his clenched teeth, and prayed to gods she was no longer sure were listening. When his eyes opened, they were brown and clear and filled with confusion. He stared at the rough wooden ceiling of her cabin for a long moment, then slowly turned his head to look at her. Their eyes met, and Ayana saw the exact second recognition flooded back into his consciousness. The memory of running, of gunshots, of cold water closing over his head. His body went rigid, every muscle tensing as if preparing to fight or flee. "Don't," she said firmly in English, placing a hand on his chest. "You'll tear the stitches." He froze, his breathing rapid and shallow. His eyes moved frantically around the small cabin, taking in the stone fireplace, the bundles of herbs, the deerskin stretched across the window opening. When his gaze returned to her, she saw fear there, raw and undisguised. She understood. He had no idea where he was, who she was, or whether she was friend or enemy. In his world, trust got you killed. "Water," she said, reaching for the clay cup beside her. She lifted his head gently and brought the cup to his lips. He drank greedily at first, then more slowly, never taking his eyes off her face. When he finished, she lowered his head back to the furs and sat back on her heels. "You were shot," she said, her English accented but clear. "I found you in the river 4 days ago. The bullet went through. Clean wound, but you lost a lot of blood. You had fever, but it's broken now." He stared at her for a long moment, and she could see his mind working, processing, calculating. Finally, in a voice rough from disuse, he spoke. "Where am I?" "My home. In the woods near the Oconee River, about 15 miles south of Milledgeville." His eyes widened slightly. Milledgeville, the state capital. He had made it farther than he thought. "You alone here?" "Yes." "Why?" The question was simple, but she heard everything behind it. Why had she saved him? Why had she risked herself? Why hadn't she turned him over to the authorities? It was the same question she had been asking herself for 3 days. "Because I could," she said finally. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was all she was willing to give him. "What's your name?" He hesitated, as if even his name was dangerous. "Samuel. Samuel Freeman, though that second part is more hope than truth." "I'm Ayana, Cherokee," he said, not a question, but a statement. He had seen her features, her clothing, heard the slight lilt in her English. "Thought they drove all of you west." "They tried." She stood and moved to the fireplace, where a pot of rabbit stew had been simmering since morning. "Some of us refused to go. You alone because you're hiding." She ladled stew into a wooden bowl and brought it back to him. We're both hiding now. Can you sit up?" With her help, Samuel managed to prop himself against the wall, though the effort left him pale and sweating. She fed him slowly, spoonfuls of broth at first, then small pieces of meat. He ate mechanically, his eyes never leaving her face, still assessing, still calculating his chances of survival. "How long before they stop looking?" he asked between bites. "They won't stop, not for a runaway, especially not one who made it this far." She set the bowl aside. "Where did you come from?" His jaw tightened. "Plantation outside Macon. Belonged to a man named Richard Thornton. You heard of him?" She shook her head. "Good. Hope to keep it that way." He touched the bandage on his chest, gingerly. "His son shot me when I ran. Thought he killed me. I made it to the river and just let go. Figured drowning was better than going back. But you didn't drown." "No." He looked at her intently. "You saw to that. Which brings me back to why. Woman living alone out here, you got to know what kind of trouble I bring. They find me here, they'll kill you same as me. Probably worse, given," he gestured vaguely at her, "given what you are." "I know what I am," Ayanna said quietly, "and I know what happens if they find you here. But they won't find you. Not unless you're stupid enough to leave before you can walk. Can't stay here forever." "No," she agreed, "but you can stay until the wound heals. After that," she shrugged, "after that, you run again. North, maybe, or west, into Cherokee territory. Some of my people might help you." Samuel laughed, a bitter sound. "Your people got problems of their own. Don't need to add a runaway slave to them. My people are all dead, or walking west," Ayanna said flatly. "I'm the only one left in these woods. So right now, you're my problem, and I don't let my problems die on my floor." Something shifted in Samuel's expression. Surprise, maybe, or respect. He studied her with new interest, seeing past the Cherokee woman who had saved him to the person underneath. "How long you been out here alone?" 3 years since the removal." "Family?" "Dead. All of them." She said it without emotion, the way she had learned to say it, as if the words belonged to someone else's story. "My mother died on the march. Father and brother too. I escaped before they could take me to Oklahoma." Samuel nodded slowly, understanding. They were both refugees, both survivors of a country that had no place for them, both living on borrowed time in these woods. "I'm sorry," he said, and she could hear that he meant it. "Don't be. Sorry doesn't bring them back." She stood and moved to the window, checking the forest beyond. The afternoon sun slanted through the pines, painting everything gold. No movement, no sound except birds and wind. "Tell me about your escape. How many days were you running?" 5, maybe 6. Hard to keep track. Samuel shifted against the wall, wincing. Left in the middle of the night. Thornton's son had just bought a new slave, a woman named Sarah. He was breaking her in. His voice went hard. I couldn't watch it anymore. Couldn't hear her screaming and do nothing. So I hit him hard enough that he went down and didn't get up right away. That's when I knew I had to run. They'll be looking extra hard for you then. You attacked a white man." "I know." He met her eyes. "Worth it, though. Even if they catch me, even if they hang me, it was worth it to see him bleed." Ayanna understood that kind of defiance. She had felt it herself the night she slipped away from the removal march, knowing she was condemning herself to a life of solitude and hiding, but unable to accept the alternative. Freedom, even the most limited kind, was worth any price. "The dogs came after you?" she asked. "Second day. I could hear them behind me getting closer. I ran through every creek and stream I could find, but they kept coming. That's when young Thornton caught up with me, him and 3 others on horseback. They cornered me near a cotton field. I fought them." He touched his chest again. "That's when he shot me. I fell, pretended to be dead until they got close. Then I ran again, made it to the river and went in. Let the current take me. Thought I was done." "You almost were. Another hour in that water, and you would have been." They sat in silence for a moment. the weight of their shared danger settling over them like a shroud. Outside, a dog barked in the distance, probably just a farmer's hound, but it made them both tense. Ayana moved to the window again, her body coiled and ready. "They come this far into the woods?" Samuel asked quietly. "Sometimes, hunters mostly, but slave catchers too if they think someone's hiding runaways." She turned to face him. "That's why you need to stay quiet. No fires during the day, no noise after dark. If anyone comes near, you hide in the root cellar under the floor. Understand?" He nodded. "You done this before? Hidden runaways?" "No, you're the first." She paused. "You're the first person I've spoken to in 3 years." Samuel stared at her, and for the first time she saw something other than suspicion in his eyes. It might have been pity, or understanding, or just recognition of their shared loneliness. 3 years alone," he said softly. "That's a long time. It's survival." She moved back to his side and checked his bandages. The wound was clean, healing well despite the circumstances. "You need rest. Sleep if you can. I'll wake you if anyone comes." But Samuel didn't close his eyes. Instead, he watched her as she moved around the cabin, tidying up, preparing more herbs, checking the door. She could feel his gaze following her, questioning, wondering. Finally, he spoke again. "Why'd you really save me, Ayana?" She stopped, her back to him, hands frozen over the bundle of yarrow she was hanging to dry. It was the question she had been avoiding, the one she didn't have a good answer for. Why had she risked everything for a stranger? Why had she broken her 3 years of careful isolation for a man she didn't know? "I saw my brother in you," she said finally, still not turning around. "The night he tried to escape the removal march, the soldiers caught him. They beat him in front of everyone, beat him until he couldn't stand. Then they shot him. He was 16 years old, and he died in the mud because he wanted to be free." She turned to face Samuel then, her eyes dry but fierce. "When I saw you in the river, saw that you had fought and run and refused to accept your chains, I thought maybe this time I could save him, even if it's not really him, even if it's too late." Samuel's expression softened, the hard edges of suspicion melting away. "I'm sorry about your brother." "Don't be sorry, just live. That's all I ask. Live, and make it worth the risk." "I'll try," he said quietly. "I promise you that." As night fell over the Georgia woods, Ayana built up the fire and settled onto a pile of furs across from Samuel. They didn't speak much more that evening, but something had shifted between them, an understanding, fragile and new, built on shared loss and shared defiance. They were two people who had every reason to distrust each other, thrown together by chance and desperation. But in the flickering firelight, watching each other across the small cabin, they began to see something they had both thought lost forever. They began to see hope. Outside, the forest settled into its nighttime rhythms. Owls calling, creatures rustling through the underbrush, the distant song of the Oconee River flowing endlessly south. And somewhere in that darkness, men with dogs and guns continued their search, following cold trails and false leads, getting closer with every passing day. But for now, in this small cabin hidden deep in the pines, 2 outcasts found brief sanctuary. And that for the moment was enough. The days that followed established a rhythm neither of them had expected. Samuel's body, though battered and scarred, proved resilient. By the end of the first week, he could sit up without help. By the second, he could walk the length of the cabin, though the effort left him breathless and pale. Ayana watched his progress with the clinical eye of a healer, changing his bandages twice daily, monitoring the wound for signs of infection, adjusting her poultices as needed. But something else was happening too, something neither of them acknowledged aloud. In the forced intimacy of the small cabin, with nothing but time and silence between them, they began to talk. It started simply enough. Samuel would ask about the herbs she used, and she would explain how golden seal fought infection, how willow bark reduced fever, how her grandmother had taught her to read the forest like a book. He listened with genuine interest, his eyes following her movements as she worked, and occasionally he would offer his own knowledge. He knew things about plants, too, learned from an old woman on the Thornton plantation who had been the closest thing to a doctor the enslaved community had. "We called her Aunt May," Samuel said one afternoon, as Ayanna ground dried mint leaves in a stone bowl. "She was probably 80 years old, blind in one eye, but she could cure almost anything. Saved my life more than once when I was a boy." "What happened to her?" Ayanna asked, not looking up from her work. "Died about 5 years back. Natural causes, which was a mercy. She used to say the secret to healing wasn't the plants themselves, but knowing which plants talked to each other. Said everything in nature was connected, and if you paid attention, the forest would tell you what it needed." Ayanna smiled faintly. "My grandmother said the same thing. Said the trees and the rivers and the animals all spoke the same language, and humans had just forgotten how to listen." "Maybe that's why we're in the mess we're in," Samuel said. "Too busy talking to hear anything else." She glanced at him then, surprised by the observation. He was sitting on the edge of the pallet, his chest bare so she could check the wound later, and in the afternoon light streaming through the window, she could see how much he had already healed. The fever-pale skin had regained some colour. The hollowness in his cheeks was filling out from her cooking. He looked stronger, more alive, and dangerously close to being able to leave. The thought disturbed her more than it should have. "Tell me about Macon," she said, redirecting the conversation. "What was it like there?" Samuel's expression darkened. "You really want to know?" "I asked, didn't I?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "The Thornton plantation was about 2,000 acres, mostly cotton. Richard Thornton owned maybe 150 people, men, women, children. Worked us from can't see to can't see, 6 days a week. Sundays we got to rest, but only because even white men recognized God's day." His laugh was bitter. "Though I'm not sure what kind of God would let what happened there continue." Ayanna stopped grinding and looked at him. "The woman you mentioned, Sarah, what happened to her?" "Same thing that happens to all the young women. Thornton's son, James, he liked to pick them out when they came of age. Said it was his right as master. Sarah was different, though. Proud, educated even. Her last master had been some kind of liberal, taught her to read and write. That made James angry. He didn't like slaves who thought they were people." Samuel's hands clenched into fists. "I could hear her every night, hear what he did to her, and I couldn't just—" "So you hit him," Ayanna finished quietly. "I did more than hit him. I broke his jaw, maybe his nose too. Left him bleeding on the ground while Sarah ran. Don't know if she made it. Hope she did." He met Ayanna's eyes. "You think that makes me a bad man? Using violence?" "I think it makes you human," she said. "And I think sometimes violence is the only language evil understands." They held each other's gaze for a long moment, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They were both survivors of violence, both shaped by it, both defiant in the face of it. And in that moment, Ayanna realized how dangerous this was becoming. Not the physical danger of hiding a runaway, but the emotional danger of caring about him. She turned back to her grinding, trying to focus on the familiar rhythm of stone against stone. But she could feel Samuel's eyes on her, could sense the questions he wasn't asking. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "You're going to anyway. Why Cherokee?" He gestured around the cabin. "Why stay here in Georgia when you could have gone anywhere? North, west, somewhere safer?" Ayanna set down the stone bowl and walked to the window. Outside, the forest was alive with late afternoon sound, birds settling for the evening, squirrels chattering their territorial disputes, the whisper of wind through pine needles. "This is my home," she said simply. "Not this cabin, but this land, this forest. My people lived here for thousands of years before the white men came. My grandmother was born in a village 20 miles from here. My great-grandmother is buried under an oak tree I can walk to in an hour. How could I leave? Where would I go that wouldn't feel like betrayal? But you're alone. Alone is better than exiled. She turned to face him. My people who went west, the ones who survived the march, they're in Oklahoma now. Indian Territory, they call it. But it's not our territory. It's just another place white men decided we could exist. I chose to stay and hide rather than go and forget. Does that make sense? More than you know, Samuel said softly. I thought about that a lot on the plantation. Thought about what it would be like to be free, to go north maybe, start over. But then I'd think about everyone I'd be leaving behind. My mother, before she died, my sister Lily, who's probably still there, friends who were closer than family. How do you run when part of you stays in chains? But you ran anyway. I did. And every day I wonder if that makes me a coward or a survivor. He paused. What do you think? Ayanna considered the question carefully. I think, she said slowly, that survival requires sacrifice. We both sacrificed connection for freedom. Maybe that doesn't make us cowards. Maybe it just makes us honest about what we can't endure. Samuel nodded, seeming to accept this. They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that only comes between people who understand each other's pain. Outside, the shadows lengthened, and Ayanna realized with a start that evening had arrived. She moved to prepare dinner. More rabbit stew, wild onions, acorn bread she had made that morning. As she worked, Samuel watched her with undisguised curiosity. You do everything yourself out here? Hunt, cook, build, heal? Who else would do it? Impressive. I grew up doing field work, cotton, tobacco, whatever Thornton needed. Never learned much about survival beyond that. Could pick 500 pounds of cotton in a day, but put me in a forest and I'd probably starve in a week. Then it's good I found you in the river and not wandering the woods, Ayanna said with a small smile, the first real smile she had given anyone in 3 years. Samuel smiled back, and something shifted in the air between them, something warm and dangerous and entirely unexpected. Ayanna felt it in her chest, a flutter of something she had thought dead. She turned away quickly, focusing on the pot, but her hands trembled slightly. They ate dinner as the sun set, painting the cabin in shades of orange and red. Samuel had regained enough strength to feed himself, and he ate with the enthusiasm of someone who had known too much hunger. Between bites, they continued talking, about nothing and everything, about their pasts and the impossibility of their futures, about small things that mattered only because they were sharing them. What's the first thing you'd do? Ayanna asked. If you were really free, not running, not hiding, just free? Samuel thought about it, chewing slowly. I'd find a place with water, a river or a lake. I'd build a house, nothing fancy, just something solid with 4 walls and a door I could lock. And I'd sit on the porch every morning and watch the sun come up, knowing nobody could tell me to move, nobody could sell me, nobody owned me anymore. He looked at her. Oh, what about you? I'd go back to my grandmother's village. I'd rebuild it, bring my people home. I'd plant corn and squash and beans the way she taught me. I'd teach the old songs to children who have never heard them. I'd make it like it was before. She paused. But that's impossible. The village is gone. My people are gone. So instead I stay here and pretend the forest remembers us. Maybe it does, Samuel said quietly. Maybe that's why you feel so at home here. Ayanna looked at him, startled by the gentleness in his voice. In the firelight, his face had lost its hard edges, the perpetual wariness that had defined him since he woke. He looked younger, softer, like someone who might have laughed easily in a different life. And for a moment, she let herself imagine what that life might have been, a world where they were just 2 people meeting by chance, without the weight of slavery and removal and certain death hanging over them. But that world didn't exist. You're healing well, she said, breaking the moment. Another week, maybe 2, and you'll be strong enough to travel. The reminder of his eventual departure seemed to dim something in Samuel's eyes. Where would I even go? North? Follow the river to Tennessee, then keep going. There are people who help runaways, safe houses and secret routes. It's dangerous, but it's possible. You ever think about going north? Every day, she admitted. But like I said, this is home. I can't leave it, even if staying kills me. That makes two of us stubborn enough to die for principle, Samuel said with a wry smile. They cleaned up after dinner in companionable silence, falling into an easy rhythm that felt practiced, despite being only days old. Ayana banked the fire for the night, while Samuel arranged the furs on his pallet. When she turned around, she found him watching her again with that intense, searching gaze. "Thank you," he said simply, "for all of this, for saving me, for healing me, for not turning away." Ayana felt something catch in her throat. "Don't thank me yet. We're not safe. We won't be safe as long as you're here." "I know, but still, thank you." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and moved to her own sleeping area across the cabin. They lay in the darkness, separated by 10 feet of packed earth floor and a gulf of impossibility. Outside, an owl called, answered by another in the distance. The night settled around them like a blanket. "Ayana." Samuel's voice came soft through the darkness. "Yes? What you said earlier, about choosing to stay and hide rather than go and forget. I understand that now. You're not hiding from them. You're hiding for yourself, for your grandmother, for your people. You're keeping something alive that they tried to kill." She closed her eyes, feeling tears prick behind her lids. "That's exactly right. Then maybe what I'm doing isn't just running. Maybe it's keeping something alive too. My dignity, my humanity, the part of me they couldn't own no matter how hard they tried." "Maybe," she agreed quietly. They said nothing more that night, but as Ayana drifted into sleep, she felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. She felt less alone, and that feeling, as dangerous and impossible as it was, wrapped around her heart like warmth returning to frozen ground. Somewhere in the darkness, Samuel lay awake, listening to her breathe, and felt the same. The hunters arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Ayana had pulled Samuel from the river. She was outside gathering wild mushrooms when she heard them. The distant baying of hounds carried on the wind, still far off, but getting closer. Her blood turned to ice. She dropped the basket and ran back to the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. Samuel was sitting by the fire, his shirt off, while he checked the nearly healed wound on his chest. He looked up when she burst through the door and immediately read the terror in her face. "Dogs," she said simply. He was on his feet instantly, all traces of casual morning comfort gone. "How far?" "Maybe a mile, maybe less. They're coming from the east." She moved to the fireplace and began scattering the coals, covering their presence. The root cellar, now. Samuel didn't argue. They had practiced this, talked about it, prepared for it, even though part of them had hoped it would never happen. He pulled on his shirt and moved to the corner of the cabin where a section of the floor lifted to reveal a narrow space below, barely 4 feet deep, dug into the red Georgia clay, lined with stones to keep it from collapsing. It was meant for storing vegetables and dried meat through the winter, but today it would serve a different purpose. Samuel lowered himself into the hole, and Ayana handed down a water skin and a knife, just in case. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, 1,000 unspoken words passed between them. "If they take me," he said quietly, "you tell them you found me here, that you were going to report me. You understand? You don't protect me, you survive." "Don't talk like that," she said, her voice sharp with fear. "Just stay quiet. Don't move. Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." She lowered the wooden panel back into place and quickly scattered furs and baskets over it, making the floor look undisturbed. Then she moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, hiding anything that might suggest 2 people lived here. Samuel's extra water cup, the larger portions of food, the second sleeping pallet she had made for him when he complained of back pain. All of it disappeared into corners and under cloth. The baying was getting closer now, maybe half a mile. She could hear the dogs clearly, and beneath their howling, the voices of men calling to each other. Her hands shook as she straightened her dress, ran fingers through her hair, tried to make herself look like a woman who had been doing nothing more suspicious than morning chores. She grabbed her basket and stepped outside, closing the door behind her. The morning was beautiful, mockingly so. Clear sky, warm sun, birds singing in the pines. She forced herself to walk calmly toward her small garden plot, kneeling among the bean plants as if she had all the time in the world. She picked a few beans, dropped them in the basket, and waited. The dogs broke through the tree line first. 3 of them, massive bloodhounds with slobbering jaws and wild eyes. They charged into the clearing, baying frantically, and converged on her cabin. Ayana's heart stopped, but she forced herself to stay still, to keep picking beans, as if vicious dogs appeared in her garden every day. The men followed seconds later, 4 of them on horseback, dressed in rough work clothes and carrying rifles. They reined in their horses at the edge of the clearing, taking in the scene with suspicious eyes. The dogs were going mad at her cabin door, clawing at the wood, howling with frustrated bloodlust. One of the men dismounted, tall and lean with a weathered face and cold blue eyes. He wore a star-shaped badge pinned to his vest, a lawman, or close enough. He approached Ayana slowly, his hand resting on the pistol at his belt. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice carrying the slow drawl of deep Georgia. "Name's Crawford, County Sheriff. You live here?" Ayana stood up slowly, wiping dirt from her hands, making herself meet his eyes. "I do." Crawford's eyes swept over her, taking in her Cherokee features, her simple doe-skin dress, the careful way she held herself. "You alone?" "I am." "How long you been living here?" 3 years. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected. "You know it's illegal for Indians to be on Georgia land without permission? There was a removal. You should have gone west with your people." "I was told I could stay if I kept to myself and caused no trouble," Ayana said, the lie coming easily. She had practiced this story in her head 1,000 times, knowing this day might come. "A missionary gave me permission, said as long as I lived quietly and bothered no one, the state wouldn't care about one Cherokee woman." Crawford studied her for a long moment, clearly deciding whether to believe her. Behind him, his companions had dismounted and were watching the dogs, who continued their frantic assault on the cabin door. "Your dogs seem interested in my home," Ayana said, keeping her voice calm. "May I ask why?" "We're tracking a runaway slave," Crawford said bluntly. "Escaped from a plantation near Macon about a month ago. Dangerous Negro, attacked his master's son, nearly killed him. We've been following his trail for weeks. Dogs picked up his scent by the river yesterday, led us straight here." He gestured at the cabin. "They seem real sure he's in there." Ayana forced herself to look confused. "There's no one in my cabin but me. You're welcome to look." Crawford's eyes narrowed. "That's so? Then you won't mind if we do." He nodded to his men, and 2 of them moved toward the cabin, rifles ready. Ayana's breath caught in her throat, but she forced herself to stay still, to look unconcerned. The men kicked open the door, she would need to fix that later, assuming there was a later, and charged inside with the dogs. For 30 seconds, that felt like 30 hours, she listened to them ransack her home. Furniture scraped across the floor. Baskets were overturned. She heard the crash of her clay water jug breaking. The dogs were wild now, their baying echoing through the small cabin, and Ayana prayed silently to every god she knew that Samuel would stay quiet, stay still, stay invisible. Finally, the men emerged, looking frustrated. "Nothing, Crawford," one of them said. "Just one room, no sign of anyone but her." But the dogs were still going crazy, circling the cabin, scratching at the walls. One of them kept returning to the same corner, the corner where the root cellar lay hidden beneath furs and baskets. Crawford noticed. "Check the floors," he ordered. Ayana's blood turned to ice, but she kept her expression neutral. The men went back inside and she heard them moving things, stomping on the floorboards, testing for hollow spaces. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms hard enough to draw blood. "Got something here!" one of the men shouted. "No, no, no, no!" Ayanna moved toward the cabin without thinking, but Crawford grabbed her arm, his grip iron hard. "Stay put," he said quietly. All pretense of courtesy gone. She heard the wooden panel being lifted, heard one of the men say, "Well, I'll be damned." Heard the distinctive click of a rifle being cocked. "Come on up, boy," one of the men called down. "Nice and slow, hands where we can see them." There was a long pause, and Ayanna felt her world collapsing. Then Samuel's voice, quiet and resigned, "Don't shoot, I'm coming up." He emerged from the root cellar with his hands raised, his face carefully blank. The men immediately grabbed him, slamming him against the cabin wall and binding his hands with rope. One of them hit him in the stomach, an unnecessary act of cruelty that made Ayanna jerk against Crawford's grip. "Easy now," Crawford said, holding her in place. "Don't make this worse for yourself." They dragged Samuel outside, and for the first time since he had surrendered, his eyes found Ayanna's. She saw apology there, and fear, and something deeper that made her chest ache. She shook her head slightly, trying to tell him it wasn't his fault, that she didn't regret anything, but she didn't know if he understood. Crawford released her arm and walked toward Samuel, studying him with interest. "You're the one from the Thornton plantation. Samuel, isn't it? Heard about you. Heard you put young James Thornton in bed for 2 weeks with a broken jaw." Samuel said nothing, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance. "Cat, got your tongue." Crawford stepped closer, his voice turning ugly. "Or maybe you just don't know how to speak respectfully to white men. That's your problem, boy." Still, Samuel stayed silent, and Ayanna saw the rage building in Crawford's face. He backhanded Samuel across the face, hard enough to split his lip. Blood ran down Samuel's chin, but he didn't make a sound. "You'll talk eventually," Crawford said. "Mr. Thornton's offering a $200 reward for your return. Wants to make an example of you. Personally, I hope he takes his time." He turned to his men. "Tie him to my horse. We're heading back to Milledgeville." As the men moved to obey, Crawford turned his attention back to Ayanna. "As for you, Cherokee, you got a lot of explaining to do. Hiding a fugitive slave is a serious crime. We could hang you for it." "I didn't hide him," Ayanna said, forcing steel into her voice. "I found him in my root cellar this morning. I was about to come report it when you arrived." Crawford laughed, a cruel sound. "That's so. Then explain why the dogs picked up his scent all over your cabin. Explain why there's bandages with fresh blood on them in the corner. Explain why you got enough food stored for 2 people. Ayanna's mind raced. "He must have broken in while I was gathering herbs. I'm gone for hours sometimes. He could have—" "Save it," Crawford interrupted. "I wasn't born yesterday. You've been hiding him for weeks, healing him, feeding him. Question is why? What's a Cherokee woman want with a runaway Negro?" "Nothing. I wanted nothing. I was just—" "Just what? Feeling charitable?" Crawford spat on the ground. "More likely you two had something going on." "That it? You been warming his bed while he recovered?" Ayanna felt rage flare hot in her chest, but she fought it down. Showing anger now would only make things worse. "Think what you want," she said coldly. "I told you the truth. Whether you believe it is your choice." Crawford studied her for a long moment, clearly trying to decide what to do with her. Finally, he shook his head. "Lucky for you, I got no interest in dragging a Cherokee woman back to stand trial. Too much paperwork, and the state probably wouldn't care anyway, but you listen to me real careful." He stepped close, his face inches from hers. "You stay out of sight. You don't help any more runaways. You don't cause any trouble, because if I hear your name again, if anyone reports you for anything, I'll come back here and burn this cabin to the ground with you in it. Understand?" Ayanna nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Crawford mounted his horse, and his men followed suit, dragging Samuel behind them like an animal. Samuel's hands were bound, a rope around his neck connecting him to Crawford's saddle. One strong kick from the horse, and he would be strangled. As they prepared to leave, Samuel looked back at Ayanna one last time. Their eyes met across the clearing, and in that moment she saw everything they had built together over 3 weeks. The conversations, the shared meals, the growing trust, and something deeper neither had dared name. She saw it all, and she saw it ending. "I'm sorry," he mouthed silently. She shook her head again, tears now running freely down her cheeks. "Live," she mouthed back. "Just live." Then Crawford kicked his horse into motion, and Samuel was jerked forward, stumbling, but managing to stay on his feet. The other riders followed, the dogs running alongside, and together they disappeared into the forest, heading east toward Milledgeville, and whatever horrors awaited Samuel there. Ayanna stood in the clearing long after they were gone, her body shaking with suppressed sobs. She had known this was coming, had known from the moment she pulled him from the river that it could only end one way. But knowing didn't make it hurt less. Finally, she forced herself to move. She walked to her cabin, stepping through the broken door, and surveyed the damage. They had destroyed everything, broken her pottery, torn her blankets, scattered her carefully organized herbs across the floor. But the worst destruction was in the corner, where the root cellar panel lay open like a wound. She walked to it and looked down into the empty space where Samuel had hidden, and something inside her broke completely. She sank to her knees and wept. She wept for Samuel, for the torture and death that likely awaited him. She wept for herself, for the brief moment of connection that had been stolen away. She wept for her brother, for her family, for her people, for every person who had ever dared to hope for freedom and been crushed for it. And when the tears finally stopped, when the sun had moved across the sky and the shadows had grown long, Ayanna stood up. She wiped her face, straightened her shoulders, and began to clean up the destruction, because that's what survivors did. They endured, they rebuilt, they continued. But as she worked, one thought kept circling through her mind, growing stronger with each passing moment. Samuel was still alive. The hunters were taking him back to Thornton's plantation, which meant he had at least a few days before they killed him. A few days was enough time. Enough time for what? She wasn't entirely sure yet. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She hadn't saved Samuel from the river just to let him die in chains. She had told him to live. Now she would make sure he could. As night fell over the Georgia woods, Ayanna finished cleaning and stood in her cabin doorway, looking east toward Milledgeville. Somewhere in that direction, Samuel was being dragged back to hell. And somewhere in her chest, a decision was crystallizing into certainty. She couldn't save everyone. She couldn't bring back her family or her people. But maybe, just maybe, she could save one man, even if it killed her trying. Ayanna left at first light, carrying nothing but a knife, a water skin, and a small pouch of dried venison. She wore her darkest clothing and moved through the forest like a shadow, using every skill her grandmother had taught her about tracking and stealth. She knew where they were taking Samuel. The Thornton plantation outside Macon was nearly 70 miles southeast, a journey that would take Crawford and his men at least 3 days on horseback with a prisoner on foot. She had maybe 2 days to get ahead of them, maybe less. She ran when the terrain allowed, her moccasined feet silent on the forest floor. She walked when exhaustion forced her to, pushing through the pain in her legs and the burning in her lungs. She followed deer trails and creek beds, avoiding roads and settlements, moving parallel to the route she knew the slave hunters would take. By nightfall of the first day, she had covered nearly 30 miles, and her body was screaming for rest. She allowed herself 3 hours of sleep in a hollow log, then continued before dawn. The second day was harder. Her muscles were stiff, her feet blistered, and the hunger gnawed at her stomach like a living thing. But she pushed on, driven by an urgency she couldn't fully explain even to herself. She barely knew Samuel. They had shared 3 weeks together. nothing more. By any rational measure, risking her life for him was insane. But nothing about the last 3 weeks had been rational. Nothing about her life had been rational. Since the moment the soldiers came to drive her people west, she had learned to stop measuring her choices by logic and start measuring them by what she could live with. And she couldn't live with abandoning Samuel to torture and death, not after she had given him hope. By the evening of the second day, she reached the outskirts of Macon. The city was larger than she expected, sprawling and busy, with wide streets and brick buildings and more white people than she had seen in 3 years. She skirted the edges, staying in the woods, until she found what she was looking for, a small encampment of enslaved people on the edge of a plantation, their quarters separated from the main house by a cotton field. She waited until full dark, then crept closer, listening to the conversations drifting from the rough cabins. She needed information, where the Thornton plantation was, what security they had, where they would be keeping Samuel. But approaching strangers was dangerous. If anyone reported her presence, she was dead. Finally, she spotted an elderly woman sitting alone outside one of the cabins, smoking a pipe and humming quietly to herself. Ayanna watched for several minutes, assessing, then made her decision. She stepped out of the shadows, moving slowly so as not to startle the woman. The woman saw her immediately and went still, her eyes widening. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "You Cherokee, ain't you?" Ayanna nodded. "I need help." "Help?" The woman looked around nervously. "Child, you got any idea how dangerous it is for you to be here? White folks catch you, they'll—" "I know," Ayanna interrupted, "but I need information about the Thornton plantation. I need to know where it is and how it's guarded." The woman studied her for a long moment, then her eyes narrowed with understanding. "This about that runaway they caught? Samuel?" Ayanna's heart leaped. "You know him. Everyone knows about him by now. Word travels fast among us. They say he nearly killed James Thornton when he ran. Say they're gonna make an example of him when they bring him back." The woman shook her head sadly. "Brave man. Foolish maybe, but brave. Why you asking about him? I need to get him out." The woman's eyes went wide. "Get him out? Child, you can't be serious. The Thornton place is a fortress. They got overseers, they got dogs, they got armed guards patrolling day and night. Even if you got inside, even if you found him, you'd never get out alive." "I have to try." "Why?" The woman leaned forward, her voice urgent. "What is he to you?" Ayanna hesitated, then said simply, "He's someone worth saving." The woman stared at her for a long moment, then shook her head in wonder. "You're either the bravest person I ever met or the craziest. Maybe both." She took a long drag on her pipe, thinking. "All right, I'll tell you what I know. But you understand. This is likely a death sentence for both of you." "I understand." The woman told her everything. The layout of the Thornton plantation, the routine of the guards, the location of the punishment house where they would likely keep Samuel until his example was made. She drew a rough map in the dirt with a stick, showing Ayanna the best approach through the cotton fields where the blind spots were when the guard shifts changed. "They'll probably hold him for a few days before the punishment," the woman said. "Thornton likes to build anticipation, likes to make the other slaves watch and understand what happens to runaways. Your best chance is before that, before they move him to the public area. How long do I have?" "Crawford left here yesterday morning with Samuel. They'll reach the plantation tomorrow, probably by noon. That gives you maybe one night to do whatever you're planning." The woman gripped Ayanna's arm. "But listen to me. If you do this, if you get him out, you can't stop running. They'll hunt you both to the ends of the earth. You understand that?" "I do." "Where will you go?" "North," Ayanna said. "As far as we can get." The woman nodded slowly. "Then God go with you, child. You're gonna need all the help you can get." She paused. "What's your name?" "Ayanna." "Ayanna, I'll remember it. And if you make it, if somehow you pull off this impossible thing, know that your story will spread. We'll tell it in the quarters, pass it along the roads, whisper it in the fields. We'll tell about the Cherokee woman who saved the runaway, about two people who refused to accept their chains. That story will give people hope, and hope is the one thing they can't take from us. Ayana felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Save that man. Then thank me. Ayana left the encampment and made her way toward the Thornton plantation, arriving just after midnight. The place was exactly as the old woman had described, a massive main house on a hill, surrounded by fields of cotton that stretched to the horizon. Barns, storage buildings, and slave quarters dotted the landscape, and she could see the orange glow of torches where guards patrolled. She circled the property twice, memorizing every detail, every patrol route, every potential obstacle. The punishment house was a small stone building near the main house, isolated from everything else. That's where they would keep Samuel, close enough for Thornton to enjoy his captive's suffering, far enough from the other slaves that his screams wouldn't disturb their sleep. She waited until 3 in the morning, when exhaustion made the guards sloppy and the patrol routes predictable. Then she moved. She crossed the cotton field on her belly, inching forward through the plants, her dark clothing making her nearly invisible in the moonlight. It took her nearly an hour to cover 200 yards, but finally she reached the edge of the compound. The punishment house was 50 feet away, with one guard sitting outside the door, his rifle across his knees, his head nodding with fatigue. Ayana picked up a small stone and threw it into the bushes 20 feet to her left. The guard's head snapped up at the sound, and he stood, peering into the darkness. When he took several steps toward the noise to investigate, Ayana ran. She crossed the open ground in seconds, pressed herself against the stone wall of the punishment house, and held her breath. The guard muttered something about animals and returned to his post. She waited until his breathing deepened again, then crept around to the back of the building. There was a small window, barred with iron, but just large enough for her to see inside. She pressed her face to the bars and whispered, "Samuel." For a moment, nothing. Then movement in the darkness, and Samuel's face appeared in the moonlight coming through the window. His eyes widened in shock and disbelief. "Ayana?" His voice was barely a whisper. "What are you? You can't be here. They'll kill you. Then we better move quickly." She examined the window bars. They were set deep into the stone, impossible to remove quietly. Is there another way out? The door, but it's locked and guarded. She thought fast. "Can you reach this window if I give you a knife?" "Why?" "I'm going to create a distraction. When the guard leaves his post, you cut through the rope or chain holding the door shut and run. Head west into the cotton field. I'll meet you there." "Ayana, this is insane. You'll never... Do you want to live or not?" She pulled out her knife and passed it through the bars. Their fingers touched briefly, and even in that moment of terror and desperation, she felt the spark between them. "Trust me." He took the knife, his eyes locked on hers. "If this goes wrong, it won't." She hoped she sounded more confident than she felt. "Be ready." She moved away from the window and circled around to the front of the building again. The guard was still dozing in his chair, his rifle loose in his grip. Ayana picked up several larger stones and crept toward the nearest barn, about 100 feet away. She threw the first stone at the barn's tin roof, creating a loud clang that echoed across the compound. The guard jerked awake, standing quickly and raising his rifle. "Who's there?" She threw another stone, then another, making it sound like someone was moving around behind the barn. The guard hesitated, clearly torn between investigating and staying at his post. Finally, he made his decision and started walking toward the barn, calling out challenges. The moment he was out of sight, Ayana ran back to the punishment house. She heard Samuel working frantically at the door, the knife sawing through rope. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night, and she kept glancing toward the barn, expecting the guard to return at any moment. The door swung open and Samuel emerged, moving stiffly but quickly. Ayana grabbed his hand, and they ran together toward the cotton field. Behind them she heard the guard shout as he returned to his post and discovered the open door. Within seconds, bells were ringing across the plantation, men were shouting, and dogs were beginning to bay. "Faster!" Ayana urged, pulling Samuel deeper into the cotton field. They ran bent over, using the plants for cover, zigzagging to confuse the dogs. Samuel was injured and weak, but fear gave him strength. They could hear the pursuit behind them, horses, dogs, men with torches spreading out across the field. They reached the edge of the plantation and plunged into the forest beyond. Ayana led them to a creek she had scouted earlier, and they waded upstream for nearly a mile, the cold water soaking them but hopefully masking their scent from the dogs. Only when she was sure they had put enough distance between themselves and their pursuers did she allow them to stop, collapsing on the creek bank, both of them gasping for air. Samuel looked at her in the moonlight, his face a mixture of amazement and something deeper. "You came for me," he said, as if he still couldn't believe it. "Of course I did." Ayana was shaking now, the adrenaline fading and leaving her weak. "Did you think I'd let them kill you?" "I thought—" He shook his head. "I thought I'd never see you again." They stared at each other, and in that moment everything changed. Without thinking, without planning, they came together in a kiss that tasted of river water and fear and desperate relief. It was brief, just seconds, but when they pulled apart, they both knew that something fundamental had shifted between them. "We have to keep moving," Ayana said, her voice unsteady. "They'll keep searching." Samuel nodded, but he took her hand and squeezed it. "Thank you. For everything. For my life." "Thank me when we're safe," she said, but she squeezed back. They stood and continued north, moving through the darkness hand in hand, two fugitives with nothing but each other and the slim hope of freedom. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit continued, but the dogs had lost the scent in the creek. They had bought themselves time. Now, they just had to use it wisely. As dawn broke over the Georgia hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Ayana and Samuel finally allowed themselves to rest. They found a small cave, hidden in a rocky outcropping, and collapsed inside, their bodies pressed together for warmth, their breathing synchronized. "Where do we go now?" Samuel asked quietly. "North," Ayana said, repeating what she had told the old woman. "We follow the river north, through Tennessee, maybe to Ohio. There are people who help runaways, safe houses, and secret routes. It'll be dangerous, but it's possible. What about your home, your cabin in the woods?" Ayana was quiet for a long moment. "That wasn't home," she said finally. "That was just a place I was surviving. Home is wherever we choose to make it. Together." Samuel pulled her closer, and she let her head rest on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. Outside the cave, the world continued its search for them, but for this brief moment, they were safe. They were together, and that was enough. "I love you," Samuel whispered, the words barely audible. Ayana closed her eyes, feeling tears slip down her cheeks. "I love you too." They fell asleep like that. Two broken people who had found wholeness in each other, two outcasts who had become family. And when they woke hours later, they would continue their journey north, toward an uncertain future, but one they would face together. Because that's what love was, Ayana realized, not the absence of danger or pain, but the willingness to face it with someone beside you, and for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't alone anymore. 3 months. That's how long they ran, through Tennessee's mountains, across Kentucky's rolling hills, always moving north, always one step ahead of the slave catchers who never stopped pursuing them. Samuel's face was on wanted posters in every town, reward increased to $500, dead or alive. Ayana became invisible beside him, just another Cherokee woman displaced by removal, unremarkable until someone looked too closely and saw the way she and Samuel moved together, the way their hands found each other in crowds, the way they shared a language of glances that needed no words. They survived on fish from streams, rabbits from snares, berries and roots that Ayana identified with the knowledge her grandmother had given her. They slept in caves and abandoned barns, under bridges and in the hollows of massive trees. Some nights they went to bed hungry, their stomachs cramping with emptiness. Other nights they ate well, and Samuel would make Ayana laugh with stories from his childhood, before Thornton, before the plantation, when he was just a boy who loved to climb trees and catch fireflies. They found help in unexpected places, a Quaker family who fed them and gave them warm blankets, an old freed slave who let them sleep in his barn and didn't ask questions, a Cherokee family in Tennessee who recognized Ayana's heritage and sheltered them for a week. But they also found danger everywhere. Twice they barely escaped slave catchers. Once Samuel fought off 3 men who tried to collect the reward, and once Ayana killed a man with her grandmother's knife when he tried to drag Samuel away while she was gathering water from a stream she had never killed before. The weight of it stayed with her, made her nightmares darker, but Samuel held her through those nights and whispered that she had saved them both, that violence in defense of love was not the same as violence from hate. By the time they reached the Ohio River, it was late January 1848. The river was partially frozen, great chunks of ice floating like white islands against the dark water. Ohio was on the other side, free soil, where slavery was illegal, where Samuel could live without chains. They stood on the Kentucky bank, staring across at freedom so close they could almost taste it. "We could cross," Samuel said, his breath misting in the cold air. "Make it to Ohio, find the Underground Railroad, maybe make it all the way to Canada." Ayana looked at him, at this man who had become everything to her in just a few months. His face was thinner now, carved by hardship and hunger, but his eyes were bright with something she had never seen in them before. Hope. Real hope. Not the desperate kind that sustained them through running, but the kind that allowed you to think about tomorrow and the day after that. "We could," she agreed. "But is that what you want? To keep running? To never stop looking over your shoulder? To live in fear that someone will recognize you and send you back?" Samuel frowned. "What's the alternative?" Ayana turned to look south, back the way they had come. "The old woman at the plantation, the one who helped me, she talked about a hidden valley, a place beyond the Oconee River where fugitives and outcasts went to disappear, a place where no white man dared to enter, where Cherokee and escaped slaves lived together in defiance of all the laws that tried to separate us. You think such a place really exists?" "I think if it doesn't, we could make it exist." She took his hands in hers. "We could go back, Samuel. Not to Thornton's land, not to anywhere they know to look, but deep into the Georgia wilderness, where even the hunters don't venture. We could find that valley, or one like it, and we could build something there. A life, a home. Maybe find others like us who are tired of running." Samuel studied her face for a long moment. "You're serious." "I've never been more serious about anything." Ayana felt the certainty crystallizing inside her. "I ran from the removal because I couldn't leave my homeland. For 3 years I survived alone because I couldn't abandon the place my people lived for thousands of years. Then I met you, and I left anyway because you were more important than the land. But what if we didn't have to choose? What if we could have both, each other and a home? It's dangerous, more dangerous than crossing to Ohio. Maybe. But it's our land, Samuel, yours by birth, mine by inheritance. And nobody has the right to tell us we can't live there together." Samuel was quiet, thinking. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face. Not the cautious smile she had grown used to, but something bigger, something that transformed his whole face. "A hidden valley," he said, "where mercy became defiance, and defiance became love." "Yes," Ayana said, smiling back. "Exactly that." They didn't cross the Ohio River that day. Instead, they turned south, back toward Georgia, back toward home. The journey was even harder than the one north had been. They were exhausted, nearly out of supplies, and winter made every day a battle against cold and hunger. But they had purpose now, a destination that was theirs and theirs alone. It took them 6 weeks to make it back to Georgia, moving carefully to avoid towns and plantations, following paths only Ayanna knew. They arrived at the Oconee River in early March, when the first hints of spring were beginning to paint the forest in shades of green. Ayanna led them along the river, deeper into the wilderness than she had ever ventured before, following stories she had heard as a child about sacred places her people had hidden when the white men came. They walked for 3 days, the forest growing denser and wilder around them, until finally they found it. A valley nestled between 2 ridges, accessible only through a narrow pass that was nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. A creek ran through the center, fed by a waterfall that cascaded down the western ridge. The valley floor was open and fertile, ringed by forest so thick it felt like walls, and it was empty, untouched, unsettled, waiting. "Here," Ayanna whispered, tears running down her face. "This is it. This is home." They built their cabin in the center of the valley, using timber from the forest and stones from the creek. It took them all spring and into summer, working dawn to dusk. But they didn't mind. Every log they placed, every stone they mortared, was an act of defiance and hope. They planted a garden, corn, squash, beans, the 3 sisters that Ayanna's grandmother had taught her about. They set snares and fishing lines. They made tools and furniture and a life, and slowly others found them. First came another escaped slave named Thomas, who had heard rumors of a Cherokee woman and a runaway living in the wilderness. Then came 2 Cherokee sisters who had survived the removal but fled the reservation in Oklahoma. Then a family of 3, mother, father, and child, who had escaped from a plantation in Alabama. Then more and more, until by the winter of 1848, nearly 20 people were living in the valley, all of them fugitives, all of them defiant, all of them free. They built more cabins, spread throughout the valley to avoid detection. They established rules: no fires visible from the ridgetops, no loud noise during the day, guards posted at the narrow pass at all times. They shared food and labor and stories, Cherokee and African traditions blending together into something new and beautiful. At night, they sang songs in 2 languages, and the children who were born there grew up knowing both heritages as their own. Ayanna and Samuel's cabin became the heart of the community. She was the healer, teaching others the plant knowledge her grandmother had given her. He was the builder and organizer, using his strength and intelligence to help the settlement thrive. And together, they were the founders, the couple whose love story gave everyone else permission to hope. Years passed. The slave hunters searched, but they never found the valley. The narrow pass was too well hidden, and the few who stumbled close were turned away by warnings and rumors of spirits and curses, stories the settlers spread and cultivated. Occasionally, someone would leave, heading north to try for Canada or west to Cherokee territory, but most stayed. This was home now, earned through suffering and built through love. On their 5th anniversary, counted from the day Ayanna pulled Samuel from the river, they stood on the ridge overlooking the valley at sunset. Below them, smoke rose from 24 cabins. Children played in the creek, and somewhere someone was singing. Samuel put his arm around Ayanna, and she leaned into him, marveling at how this moment had seemed impossible 5 years ago. "Do you ever regret it?" Samuel asked quietly. "Giving up the chance to go to Ohio, to be truly safe?" Ayanna shook her head. "This is safer than anywhere else could have been, not because there's no danger, but because we face it together, all of us." "The old woman was right," Samuel said. "Our story did spread. I've heard it repeated back to me 3 times now by people who didn't know they were talking to me. They call it the legend of the Cherokee woman and the river slave, the mercy that became forbidden love." "It's not a legend," Ayanna said, smiling. "It's just our life. Maybe that's what legends are, just lives that people need to believe in." They stood in silence for a while longer, watching the sun set over their hidden valley, over the home they had built from nothing but defiance and hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were always challenges, always dangers, always the threat that someone would discover them. But tonight, they had this moment, this peace, this evidence that mercy once given could not die. "I would do it all again," Ayana said suddenly. "Every moment, every danger, every hardship, I would do it all again to get here, to this place, with you." Samuel pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head. "So would I. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for being worth saving." As darkness fell, they walked back down into the valley, hand in hand, toward their cabin where a fire waited and dinner was cooking, and their 2 children, a boy and a girl, 3 and 5 years old, were probably driving their grandmother crazy with questions about everything, toward community and family and the life they had built in defiance of every law that said they shouldn't exist. The river had given them to each other, half drowned and half dead with hope. And they had taken that gift and built something eternal from it, proof that love, once kindled, could survive anything, even in a world that tried its hardest to extinguish it.